Social media as a tool for social justice. It sounds great, doesn't it? So does the term keyboard warriors. Holding political leadership accountable, using whichever platform as a forum for debate and discussion, mobilizing against socio-economic injustices, the list goes on. But are youth utilizing their freedom of expression on social media to the fullest extent in speaking out? Or are too many of them crossing the line into extremism and incitement to violence and the untrammeled spread of disinformation? And what happens when the threat of regulation comes into the picture? We all know that even offensive, shocking, and disturbing speech isn't necessarily a danger to public order or a prompt to incitement to violence. But many governments will look for excuses to regulate and even shut down the internet and point to a radicalized youth abusing their free speech as the reason. So how does the youth beat back the attempts to silence dissent and use social media for the greater good? With me today to explore some of these burning questions are Bertha Tobias, youth leader and speaker, and Dr. Philip Santos, senior lecturer in the Department of Communication at the Namibia University of Science and Technology. I'm Gwen Lister, your host of this 25th episode of our popular Free Speak podcast, in which we look at all things media. Welcome to you both, and let's dive straight in. First of all, to Bertha, and I must say before I start with the actual question, I believe that congratulations are in order. I believe that the Shut It All Down movement has been given an award by the African Union Envoy, and I believe there's been a bit of money involved in that award too. So that leads into my first question, which is really for you to indicate to us ways and means that the youth can and have made a transformative difference in their societies by campaigning for just causes on social media. Bertha, maybe you could give us some social justice issues that you think are most prominent among the Namibian youth, and I suppose the Shut It All Down movement is one of them, primarily a woman-driven movement. Can you share some of the campaigns you've been involved in or know about that have brought about change?
All right. Thank you so much for the question, Gwen, and thank you so much for having me. So just on that very backdrop, right, of hashtag Shut It All Down, I think that's a great starting point, as you've rightly mentioned, when we talk about youth beginning to understand that they do have power when they mobilize and band together. While obviously that power comes with the dangers of, as you pointed out once again, radicalization, I think what we've seen increasingly in 2020 and 2019 is we've seen slut shame walk,
Right.
We've seen VCRC, we've seen Outright Namibia, we've seen Sister Namibia, and all of these are primarily youth-led movements. But I think what's more profound or fascinating particularly is the fact that many, there's this quote that I recently read, right, that says there's nothing more powerful than a group of people doing something just because they want to do it.
Right.
And I think on that very backdrop, Namibian youth right now have decided that they want to be involved, they want to be engaged, and what we've seen obviously, and I think most recently with Shut It All Down, and with the abortion protests,
Right.
and with the protests on racism and hashtag gallows must fall. All of these were movements and initiatives led by young people who understand that, one, they can mobilize, two, the scope of influencing policy and decision making and sort of shaping the national discourse and dialogue and subsequent action is not mutually exclusive from the space in which they operate.
Absolutely.
So I think what's been beautiful to observe from Namibian youth is them understand, and I think this is something we're going to touch on later, is understanding that there's a certain power that we have, and conventionally and historically, it has arguably been inconsistent with the spaces in which policy is made. But how do we influence that policy? That's why you see young people going to shut down parliament.
Right.
It's that confrontation, I think, that really communicates that young people understand that there's a need to bridge that gap and that they have the power to bridge that gap.
Before I turn to Philip, Bertha, I wonder if I could ask you, what in your view, and you've named a lot of these campaigns, what has been perhaps the the most successful, and why do you think that has been? What has captured, if you want, the imagination of the youth in terms of all these various hashtag protests?
Right. So I can think of two big ones. I mean, obviously, Shut It All Down.
Right. Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think that. And the Slut Shame Walk, I believe that happened in late 2019. One, and I think this speaks to the first part of your question as well, is what youth is currently concerned with, and that's women's rights in Namibia. And
I'm seeing women come to the forefront here, I
definitely,
must say.
Definitely.
Yes.
It's women's
Yes.
rights and it's gender-based violence. And I think why that has been successful has been two main things, Gwen. One, it's centered around an ideology that is almost intuitively appealing to lots of young people, given the social pandemic that we're facing, which is gender-based violence.
Right.
So that's it. But secondly, I think it's been allowing any and all kinds and forms of young people to really take ownership of these movements. So persisting in the narrative that Shut It All Down or Slut Shame Walk is essentially faceless and leaderless.
Right.
While there's the argument that, well, we all know there's a leader.
Sure.
Yeah, sure, that's true. But pushing the narrative to say that, no, it's leaderless and anybody can take ownership of it, anybody can organize a protest and it will be legitimate and valid and acknowledged. I think that's made these particular movements powerful because you decentralize the leadership, which is obviously a feature that is not fully present in sort of formal organized partisan politics.
Right, and it definitely gives guidance, I think, to the youth on the way forward.
Definitely.
And how to mobilize online protests. Philip, we're essentially talking here about social justice. And then there's a need, I think, for us to develop a broader understanding of this concept of social justice. Can you perhaps elaborate on this and maybe as you do so help us differentiate perhaps between the topics of youth activism and radicalization online?
Okay. Let me thank you, Gwen, and thank you for inviting me on this podcast. Let me start by addressing the second part of the question, which is the differentiation between radicalization and activism. Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't see a difference between the two. I see them as elements that can be placed in a continuum with radicalization itself having a continuum between existing sort of between what is acceptable and what is probably seen by general society as unacceptable.
Right.
So radical politics is not apathy. It's you can't dissociate it from democratic politics. It's part and parcel of democratic politics, especially where social justice issues are concerned. But radicalization, which is associated with, say, fundamentalist politics, the sort of politics that we saw undergirding, say, the ISIS movements, Boko Haram,
right,
Al-Shabaab and things like that, is the one that is probably toxic.
Or Quanon, for that matter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I wouldn't separate them. Activism can also be thought of in the same ways is activism, which is definitely consistent with democratic practices, and then activism, which may cross certain boundaries that even people whose idea of democracy is very loose may not be comfortable with. Mm-hmm. So rather than separate them, probably we could place them in a continuum and say, okay, what sorts of radical politics is acceptable and what sorts of activism is acceptable within the parameters of democratic politics.
Okay.
Then coming to social justice, probably I'll draw on two conceptions, one which is associated with Nancy Fraser's thought and one which is associated with Axel Honneth. Nancy Fraser argues that social justice is literally just a question of parity of participation. Mm-hmm. In other words, the way the economy, the way the cultural sphere, and the way political participation or representation is organized in society must be such that these three dimensions do not limit the participation of an individual in public life.
Right.
But Honneth sees this as a problem because participation becomes the starting point of thinking about social justice. And for him, it shouldn't be the starting point. The starting point should be the individual. So the individual must be accorded, for him, love, esteem, and recognition, so that once the individual is endowed with these let's say, rights or affordances, then their participation in public life is already guaranteed to be, I think, egalitarian, or they are going to be respected as a fully fledged individual. Not just an individual, but an individual who also has a choice to belong to particular social
Right.
groups.
I get that.
And that social group must then be accorded those affordances within the dimensions of the economy, the cultural sphere, and also political representation.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that, Philip, because I think it's very important. You know, we use terms like social justice without really giving them or interrogating them as to their actual meaning. So I think those two alternate points of view that you've put across will give people something to think about in that context. But also turning back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, Bertha, and that was the issue of information cocoons, or what are also called, I think, echo chambers, where people parrot views and ideas according to their own prejudices. Do you think the youth are susceptible to this? Or do you feel that in these movements, which have been so successful, the majority of youth are exercising independent thought and action?
Right. So I think there's two parts to that question. The first, do I think young people are susceptible to it? Yes and no. So yes, because I think young people generally have I guess a more intensive understanding of their access to information, access to information that
Right.
goes beyond the scope of their immediate context.
Okay.
So yes, in that regard, because I think the more information you come across, the more susceptible you are to sort of look for information that confirms what you are already looking to confirm.
Right.
No, because I think sort of susceptibility to groupthink is not exclusive to young people. I think it's applicable and or possible to thrive. For groupthink to thrive in any group that is centered around very strong ideologies that are very appealing and that are very compelling.
Right.
So yes and no in that regard. The second part of your question is a lot more interesting because I think that was a lesson that I personally learned, and I think a lot of other people learned as well during #ShutItAllDown and all other movements, which is sort of how much individual intellectual agency do you have, and are you allowed to exercise
Right.
when you are explicitly part of a specific movement? And I think a brilliant example of this that we see is, let's take Shut It All Down again as a prime example, right? Where we look at, okay, there's obviously a spectrum there. There's young people who are on the extreme end who want to burn it all down and literally shut it all down to the ground and start again. There's young people who believe they can collaborate with sort of existing structures.
Exactly.
Those are seen as sellouts. They're seen as being successfully having been co-opted. So then that begs the question of how do you go about ensuring credibility within a movement when at the core you share certain values and principles, but in terms of maybe execution or articulation of those values, there's a difference.
Right.
So I think because of the human nature, I guess, the fundamental human nature to connect and to feel part of a group and to feel belonging and love and acceptance, as rightly pointed out, yes, there is a susceptibility in particularly radical, bordering on fundamentalist politics or ideologies or movements to kind of self-betray when you are more on the conservative side of executing what is a probably left-wing kind of body of thinking. So I think definitely in that fear of being cast as a sellout, there is a susceptibility to subscribing to groupthink or subscribing to a particular set of principles of execution that you don't necessarily agree with.
Right.
Yeah.
I've also, you probably know better than me, both of you, that I read about recently, and I really cannot think of the name, but I believe there's now an app out which can measure the kind of news and information that you are accessing online. And apparently it gives some kind of barometer, indicates red when you kind of exactly trying to confirm your own prejudices and offering you different alternatives in terms of information to give you a slightly broader view. So that's quite interesting and ties in with that. Maybe I think if we look at the African continent, for example, Uganda is probably such a glaring example of what not to do with the internet. Obviously, it's been in the recent elections. Social media was a major platform on which the opposition and supporters of the youthful musician Bobby Wine, who was challenging the old Museveni presidency, and literally it is old, were able to expose the violent acts of ruling party members, advocate for social change, and organize against the excesses of power. But Museveni, whose supporters were then targeted online, much like Trump was, and shut down, hit back immediately and just shut it all down. Isn't this, Philip, a good indicator that regulation, and there's a lot of talk around regulation for all the reasons we've mentioned, is simply used to target political dissent, which is fully within the bounds of free expression?
Yes.
Your views?
Yeah. Regulation is a touchy topic.
It's a touchy topic,
and also complex. For me, I think it shouldn't be read in black or white kind of yes.
Yeah.
I mean, what Uganda is a very extreme case. It's a very tricky reference point for thinking about regulation. We expect polities that are of an authoritarian bent to react in the manner that the Museveni government reacted, which is to literally just disable all communicative platforms that would sort of enable citizens to interact among each others. But regulation, for me, must be again thought of within a continuum, which is to look at regulation which is acceptable and regulation which is completely unacceptable. Regulation that is not consistent with democratic principles as specified in national constitutions and which is not consistent with international instruments that generally guide how local legal frameworks are framed is not a good thing. But regulation which is put in place to enhance democratic politics is, for me, a good thing. For instance, regulation that would sort of curtail hate-driven politics, for instance, the kind that you find in Africa, I think, around ethnicity. I did a study in Zim on how a particular group on Facebook, for instance, sort of drove people apart from each other along ethnic lines. So the more they spoke, the more they interacted, the more they sort of fell apart.
Right, the sort of spectre of Rwanda,
that kind of thing. Yeah. So once someone says something, this one takes a more extreme position like that, to a point where they literally started threatening to kill each other, to hunt each other down, and so forth and so forth.
Okay.
That kind of thing, I don't think, even if we want to try and justify free speech, would be consistent with democratic polities, because unguarded, it can easily lead to people dying and other bad things happening. But regulation that would make the sorts of activities that Betha has just highlighted impossible to flourish is bad. Wouldn't be a good thing for democracy at all. So some people have proposed what they refer to as regulated regulation.
Yeah.
So you regulate, but that regulation must also be regulated in such a way that it doesn't threaten democratic politics as provided by within, say, a constitutional framework or by international instruments, which within which to think about how to enhance free speech, free interaction, and freedom of association, and so on and so on.
Okay, I'm tempted to go down this regulation path because it's a very fascinating discussion, as you say, and I've got a lot of personal feelings about it because, of course, who does the regulation is a very critical question. And given the immediacy of social media, by the time you've regulated an issue, it's already out there. So there's kind of a lot to discuss. But let me quickly turn to Bertha. I think obviously we want it to be our aim, and I think Philip has alluded to this, to make it possible for youth and activists to find voice and to find community, while at the same time curbing and preventing saboteurs, if you want to call them that, and extremist groups from mobilizing and organizing. Although it's kind of at the heart of the regulatory challenge, many believe that people who are online entertaining extremist views, and I mentioned this earlier, aren't necessarily going to mobilize in real life. The other aspect that I read about was someone described the internet like a car. You know, there are a lot of car accidents, but because they're car accidents, we're not going to say we're going to do away with cars, because we all need them and basically they're useful. And I found that quite an interesting analogy vis-a-vis the internet, which again gives a lot of good. And must we now clamp down on it for the sake of those perhaps few exceptions out there that are driving things to a violent conclusion? Bertha, would you like to give your opinion on that?
Yeah, definitely. So one, as I'm listening to Philip speak, I think the idea of regulated regulation, I love that because I think it beautifully articulates my own thinking just about regulation, and how I think regulation would be sort of acceptable in cases where sort of the speech that is being cultivated is one which directly harms the danger and immediately endangers a particular group or fundamentally undermines the sanctity of life of a particular group or specific kind of individual. So I think regulated regulation would be the answer. But what I do want to say with the first part of your question, Gwen, about, I don't think we should undermine the possibility of online violence to manifest into offline violence or into real life consequences. For two reasons. One, because as we've mentioned earlier, I think ideology, I'd say, is the most powerful force in the world. I think that's what keeps communities together, and that's what drives people apart along different kinds of lines, whether it's ethnic or racial. So I think there's two ways in which online violence and the incitement thereof can translate offline. Just the first one being, you never know who's watching, you never know who's listening, you never know who's witnessing an ongoing conversation or an ongoing exchange of particular ideas. And I think specifically within the context of social justice, when you normalize and allow a certain kind of discourse which fundamentally undermines the sanctity of a particular group or the humanity of a particular group, you run the risk of not directly inciting violence, but you run the risk of not, I think, having taken early measures to protect that group because of whoever's watching. And secondly, it's not lost on me right now as we're having this conversation that even Shut It All Down started with a single tweet where someone said, we need to do something, what can we do? And within the span of 24 hours, the central business district was literally shut down. So while that might not have been, fundamentally violent at its core, or at least the ideology that was driving it, that definitely shows us the power of social media. Because what I think it does is not only does it give you the platform to kind of engage and learn and unlearn, but it also allows people to confirm their biases. And this goes to the app that you're talking about. And once that bias is confirmed, then you realize that, there's hundreds of other people who think this way. Where do I put my effort and where do I put my energy to sort of amplify whatever this cause is in real life? Then you have movements like Shut It All Down or like Slut Shame Walk. And then you have violence and confrontations. And I think with that said, I think we should be hypersensitive and really alert to what goes online, and that doesn't necessarily mean regulation, obviously, because that I think has very, very real life consequences. I mean, and just to bring it back home, and just very quickly to make it more, I guess contemporary or relevant to whatever we saw last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, when a famous celebrity in Namibia was literally being dragged for one tweet that seemed even slightly homophobic. And it wasn't explicitly so, and not to say that that's justifiable, but a follow-up tweet to that was, the reason we had to come so strongly at this is, again, you don't know who's watching, you don't know who subscribes to the credibility of that person's platform.
Absolutely.
And just shortly after that, we saw, a famous comedian in Namibia was attacked because of their sexuality. And that's not to say that necessarily there's a cause and effect relationship there, but it is to say that what we do online has real life consequences.
Absolutely. And the this kind of concept of mob justice online. I've seen it happen. And I mean, it can get pretty ugly, let's face it, where they go after someone, and it may at times even be a very innocent comment that has sparked the kind of reaction. One person says it. Again, I'm thinking in the back of my mind about anonymous accounts. It always bothers me, and I know we can't do away with them in their entirety, but I always like to think in a democracy, the more people who speak out under their own names and with their own voices, it always also gives one, I think, a little bit more, can I say once more, thoughtful before we put our words online, and those anonymous accounts are often out there just to stir it up, and it seems people don't recognize the difference between an authentic voice and somebody who is behind the scenes really whipping up, and that happens as well, sentiments for one reason or another, whether it's misogyny or whatever it may be. Philip, just a quick question there. Look, often I think of violent extremism is not an invention of social media or the internet.
Yes.
So if we took it all away,
Yeah.
would it stop happening?
Absolutely not. I mean, the social media is just I think a mediating platform. It's a platform for mediation. Of course, media to some degree are political actors. They do things or discourses that play out on media in general and social media in particular may translate into political action. But by and large, what happens in the media is actually the venting of what is already a problem in society. It's not invented at the level of mediation. So mediation is pretty much what makes what is already happening in society visible.
Right.
So to blame social media or any other media, for that matter, for what is happening in society would be to overplay the urgency of the media in shaping political, socio-political action and things like that. So I don't think that we can attribute bad things that happen in society solely to the media, although we cannot discount the media's urgency. We don't know to what degree, but certainly there would be some degree to which the media itself can catalyze or inflame particular scenarios that are already there, and things like that.
And in many ways, we should be actually looking at what's happening in our own societies before we look at what is happening or tackling what is happening online. Because definitely I would think the one prompts the other to a larger extent, perhaps. Philip, perhaps just to add on to that before I turn to Bertha, this issue about regulation, and I've heard you about regulating the regulators. So whether it is governments, whether it is the tech giants, or whether it is civil society in some way regulating the regulators, couldn't this end up limiting freedom of expression? I'm worried about this regulation concept, and I think you can hear that. What are your views on that? Because where do we find the ideal recipe or solution? And the other thing is, of course, just to bring in, everybody seems to look at the US strategies around regulation, and we keep referring back to the Trump example and so on, is what speaks to what we're doing in the rest of the world. And that's not right, because we're all very different in our own environments, online and offline. And so is it a one solution fits all? Or do we really need to look at national or regional solutions to this problem?
Absolutely. I think the context matters in a very, very significant way. You want to look at what the contextual dynamics are and how these shape the way society relates with the media and the other way around. And I think the US is an example of how failed regulation can throw things out of control, literally. So, I mean, the situation where we find ourselves in now is much more dangerous than when you have publicly accountable institutions spearheading regulatory activities than to have a private company or a company which is not accountable to citizens deciding what voices to plug out and what voices to
Absolutely.
leave playing out in the public sphere. And I understand people may sympathize with Twitter's switching off of Trump's account, but if you look at the Australian example now, the dangers of leaving these decisions to companies becomes that much more clearer, because in Australia, what Facebook did was to plug out news organizations, even stories that were about the pandemic. So when Australians woke up on that day when Facebook decided to plug out these things, Australians couldn't access news feeds through
Absolutely.
Facebook.
Yes.
This is deadly serious. I mean,
Sure.
if you are to think about the impact of regulation when left to special institutions that are not accountable to citizens.
Exactly.
At least if regulatory activities are conducted by institutions which are accountable to the public through maybe parliament or some other such setups, it can always be revisited every now and then and adjusted to the situation as it pertains on the ground in relation to the context within which this is happening.
Right.
Albeit that must be done in a way that is so minimalist in terms of its potential to restrict expression.
Yeah, that's a good point, Philip. Thank you for that. Bertha, also just quickly turning back to, because we're going to have to come to an end very quickly, turning back to the issue of all these great campaigns that the Namibian youth have been waging online. I often ask myself the question when I see these campaigns happening, whether it's around GBV or abortion or whatever, are the political leadership really listening? This often bothers me. Because as you know, they make sporadic inroads into social media, and you'll suddenly see one minister is on and interacting quite frequently. A couple of people may come after him for one or other thing that he's done, and suddenly he's gone back and he's withdrawn his account or it's dormant. And so it bothers me that the youth may be using this forum to speak out about, again, social justice, but then the very people we're trying to talk to have withdrawn into silence. What are your perceptions around this, and what could be done to encourage them? There are one or two. We all know the Justice Minister, for example, is one of the better political figures who is answering most of the questions that come her way. But I'm kind of watching nervously, because as soon as something happens and people really go after her, and the act that's currently been passed that is so controversial before Parliament is one of those examples, if that happens, that she may also decide, I'm off social media, I'm not taking this. What quick thoughts around that before we conclude?
Right. So I think, so this is so complex, I believe, because it speaks to, I think it very importantly and significantly speaks to different demographics, age demographics specifically, and their level of comfort in engaging in a particular kind of environment and or medium. So obviously the youth are more tech savvy. Lots of our conversations take place on Twitter. A lot of our learning and national dialogue among the youth takes place on social media. Whereas obviously that's not the case with formal organized partisan politics. So I think what would be important to look at there is, where is the world headed? Not just the international community, but just what makes the most sense in an increasingly digitalized world. And it's obvious that it's the internet, and it's obvious that that's where the magic happens, essentially.
Right.
So to that, obviously, as a young person who's biased because I'm a young person, it's get with the program, right? To
Sure.
political figures who are not on the internet.
Sure.
And this makes me think of a very pivotal discussion point as well that was raised by lots of young people last year during the hashtag Shut It All Down protests, which is to say, okay, the statistics show that a lot of gender-based violence victims, for example, are young women. So where do you find lots of young women? You can find them on the internet.
Right.
So why is that information not accessible? Why, for example, is the Twitter account of the Ministry of Gender not active.
Absolutely.
When that's a rife and a really valuable opportunity to share information.
Correct.
So I think that's what makes it complex. Really, is there's a reluctance almost by formal or organized politics to not engage in social media, not just because of the lack of familiarity, but also I think there's a certain degree of protection that comes from hiding from social media because you
Certainly.
don't have a responsibility or an
Certainly.
obligation to have an account on any social media platform. And I think that leads to frustration. And that's why young people go to the Parliament Gardens and shut things down, because where else can we reach you?
Sure. Okay. That's a good point.
Yeah. So the bureaucracy, so young people are frustrated by the bureaucracy, and I think politicians will be frustrated by the immediacy, because that the immediacy of social media challenges and interrogates the bureaucracy that they can usually hide behind, or the terminology and the red tape. So there's that too. But I'd say just get with the program, or there will, I think, I anticipate and foresee just increased frustrations and more division, which is not going to breed anything meaningful in the long run.
Exactly. Some really excellent points there, Bertha. As we come to the end, I think there's certainly the three of us sitting here agree that social media is a tool that can help the youth achieve social justice and also help democracy work better. It's also, I think, an ideal medium to convey information. So less, in my view, is definitely more when it comes to issues like regulation. At the same time, it's very important to empower our young people. So here I want to look at the users on the secure use of the internet, as well as the need for civil behavior, because I'd like to think people would, in a way, subscribe to a code of conduct before they go online, so that our regulation happens proactively rather than after the fact, so that they learn how to conduct discourse and to disagree and do so vehemently if possible, but also just to, I don't want to use the word respect because the politicians use it all the time, but I think what civil behavior speaks to that. And also to learn to distinguish, very importantly, between truth and falsehood in their activism and spurn disinformation. So last question to both of you. How do we go about doing this? Because, as I say, there's a lot of great things happening on the internet that the youth are doing. There's also some big negatives. How do we address this whole issue? Just a couple of lines from the both of you to end us off.
Okay. I mean, social media are now such a vast platform through which public discourse is playing out, and to think of an all-encompassing regulatory framework for social media is almost impossible. And I think, as you rightly point out, and as Beth has also highlighted, it's a very good thing that the youth are now so engaged in politics and public conversations, which is something that we're lamenting just before the onset of this social media going backwards.
Certainly.
But I think, coming to the question that you've asked, micro environments on social media can be the starting point for thinking about how to cultivate rich discourse which is within the bounds of what we may refer to as civil. So for instance, if there is a group, it must have some framework through which to regulate, that's not a...
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Through which to define discourse,
right,
without using those terms which you rightly point out may end up policing the conversation.
Correct.
We don't want to police the conversation, but to sort of at least keep it within what everyone may agree is civil discourse.
Right.
Although we may have different ideas, but at least those ideas must be expressed in ways that recognize the other.
Exactly.
Yes.
My rights end where yours begin, kind of approach. Bertha, last thoughts from you.
Right. So very quickly, so I think with the idea of security and respectability, I'm also using that term very reluctantly,
Okay.
is important to look at, okay, which demographic or which age group of young people are primarily engaged in issues of national discourse.
Right.
I like to actively reject the narrative that young people are sort of clueless children who need to be, taught about how to respect other
Certainly,
people. I think if you have a 20-year-old being explicitly disrespectful and being sort of explicitly just, inflammatory on social media, they need to be held accountable just like everybody else, as opposed to being treated like a child simply because they're quote unquote young.
Exactly.
And just the last angle to answer that question about the angles through which we can engage each other, I think the idea of civil discourse, specifically within the context of Namibia, is very touchy. Because it reminds us almost of a collective trauma that young people have, which is the consistent use of respectability politics to not hold government officials or to not hold institutions accountable when they should be accountable to citizenry. And I think it even goes back to social and very historically significant ideas about what does civilization mean, who gets to define what that looks like, and why is their definition valid and legitimate enough for everyone to have to subscribe to. So I think, if anything, the bottom line, I think, is there should be respect should characterize a conversation. And by respect, I don't mean the ceremonious respectability
Quite.
that Namibians often
And the
subscribe to.
honorables and the so on.
I mean respect for
Yeah.
humanity, respect for discourse, respect for reaching a meaningful, maybe not consensus, but some form of meaningful conversation.
Exactly.
We both walk away with something meaningful.
Yeah.
Anything outside of that, I think individuals need to be held accountable. But I think we need to stay away from what respectable civil conversation looks like, because quite frankly, different groups, that looks differently for different groups, as long as the outcome is some meaningful engagement in the end.
Right. I think that's a perfect note to end this podcast on. Bertha, Philip, thank you so much for what's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.